Well, my name is Mary Holmes, and I'm not a scientist, but I did work as a librarian, and I started working as a librarian in Birkbeck College in London. And then I met there my husband, and we got married, and he was doing a PhD with Rosalind Franklin and with Aaron Klug. And then when he finished, he went to Boston. I went to Harvard Medical School to do a postdoc. And I worked then in Boston University Library for 18 months while he was there. And then we came back and had our first child, and I thought I would never work again. But then 6 years later, we came to Heidelberg, and Ken had a job with the Max Planck Institute for Medizinische Forschung. And by that time I had 3 children. And the only thing that had led me up to science was A, hearing my husband talk to other scientists, and B, the person who examined him and who was later the head of the institute or deputy head of the institute where he worked in Cambridge was Sir John Kendrew, who then later became the first director of EMBL. And the first time John came to Heidelberg, Ken said we should invite him round for a meal. So we invited him round for a meal, and suddenly, much to my absolute amazement, he said, "I would like you to be the librarian at EMBL." And I said, "But John, I haven't worked for 11 years, and I don't know anything about computers," because I used to get the Library Association record, and I could see that in America and in England they were using computers in libraries, and he said, "I don't want a computerized library." So I said, "But I've got 4 young children. I don't think I can do this." And I kept trying to see him to say, "I cannot do this job." And then various people would phone me up. This was in about 1973, I think. There was no EMBL building. John was working. He had an office in the Krebsforschungszentrum, and he had the head of administration was there, and various secretaries, and a few groups. Cell biology was in the Krebsforschungszentrum. The computer department and the instrumentation department had some huts at the back of the Max Planck Institute for Care and Physique just next door. And somebody phoned me up and he said, "We've got more money than scientists. Could you order 30, take out subscriptions for 30 journals?" And he said, "I hear you're going to be the librarian." I haven't said I'm going to be the librarian, but if you like, I can order you take out subscriptions for 30 journals, if that's what you would like, with back numbers for 5 years. So I came to see the head of administration, who was at that time, he was there for a short time, a man called Mr. Embling, who came from England, but he was a friend of Sir John Kendrew, and he could speak very good German. He'd studied in Germany. And I said, if I order 30 journals, what are we going to do with them? And what is my position? My youngest child had just gone to kindergarten, and so we bought 2 cupboards, and he said, "Oh, you can have a table in the corner of my room in the Krebsforschungszentrum." So that's how the library started. So I didn't think about taking a job here. The job sort of came to me. And
so there was a library before there was actually a physical EMBL institute.
Yes, this was in 1974.
And there was an EMBL before there was a physical building, to some extent.
Yes, there was,
pieces.
Because there were, I should think, about 10 groups scattered around Heidelberg.
I see.
And I just looked on my and the opening day for EMBL was the 4th of July, 1974, and we had a big party up in the Cairn Physique up there. But there was still no building, so we went on much as we had been going on. I was given 3 rooms in the Alte Biochemie. Luckily, there is a very good furnishing shop for libraries in Speyer. So I could go to Speyer and choose the bookshelves, and and the cupboards and the table and the desk, and there were 3 very little rooms. But twice a week, all the scientists used to, and John Kendrew said, I want you to set it up so that we can have internal seminars on Tuesdays, every other Tuesday. So I bought tables, chairs and desks and a blackboard, and they used to come, the 10 group leaders used to come on Tuesdays and have their lectures.
Okay, so that's fantastic.
Each one gave a lecture, which was very good for me, because I could find out what people were doing.
But this is also very interesting because, you know, it now occurs to me that this was, at the time, the place of knowledge. I mean, people couldn't really go on the internet and Google up or do a PubMed, so they had to come to you for knowledge, and it makes sense that all the exchange of knowledge and the seminars would be there.
Yes,
so beautiful.
And they all met each other because, I mean, they were very separated. They didn't really know the people who in the Krebsforschung didn't know the people in the huts up here. So this was a very good idea.
So the embryonic part of the community started there, around the library, if you will, because you were also scattered in different places. You know, let's step back for a moment, because you also witnessed the decision of how the EMBL came to be initially in Heidelberg, I guess. There must have been negotiations. So what, you know, how was the idea of putting it in Heidelberg, you know, especially because the driving force seemed to have been British scientists in some form, right?
Well, when it was decided that there should be a laboratory, I mean, EMBL, EMBO had already started in the 1960s, so that was quite a secure organization, which had, I think, 200 members in the first case of European scientists, and was giving money to young scientists who needed to travel to another country to do research. So that was quite securely there. And then Max Perutz and John Kendrew both got their Nobel Prize, I think, in 1962. And also Jim Watson and Francis Crick. And they were all in Stockholm. And there was somebody called Leó Szilárd who was visiting CERN in Geneva. And I think the name of the head of CERN was then Vicky Weizkopf. And so Leó Szilárd was a Hungarian who had worked on the atomic bomb. And he was so horrified at what happened with Hiroshima and Nagasaki that he decided he wouldn't work on physics anymore. He would change to molecular biology. And he was talking to Vicky Weizkopf, and he was saying that it would be a very good thing if there could be a molecular biology European laboratory like CERN, and perhaps it could be down in Geneva next to CERN. And so they said to each other, well, Kendrew and Jim Watson are in Stockholm, shall we contact them and ask them if they'd like to come down here and we could discuss this? So they did. Jim Watson and John Kendrew went down there, and there was the first discussion that there should be a laboratory for molecular biology, but of course not knowing where it was going to be. And so I think they went round the various countries and asked them. They didn't want to be in Switzerland. They thought Switzerland had too much international organizations already. France would have liked it, and they wanted it to be in Nice, I think. But then Germany said, we have nothing, and we will only contribute if we have it in Germany. And the first suggestion was that it should go to Martinsried near Munich, where the Max Planck Institute for Biochemistry is. But John Kendrew didn't like that idea. He thought it might be overshadowed by the Biochemistry Institute. He would have liked the Starnberger See. But Ken, my husband, was working in the Max Planck Institute for medical research, and he had one person working with him called Peter von Sengbusch, and there was another professor called Hermann Boujard, and they got together and said, why don't we go to the Heidelberg University and suggest that it should be in Heidelberg. And they also went to Stuttgart to the Ministerium and suggested that it would be a good idea to have the institute in Heidelberg. And Munich was very, very upset, but they did go, they did have a site committee, went down there, and they looked around the Institute for Biochemistry. But one of the stipulations from one of the scientific committees was that EMBL should be built next to a big physics institute, so that we, EMBL, would not have to build a huge physics department or engineering department, because one of the ideas was that it would be a place where one would build new scientific instruments that could be used by all Europeans and would be too expensive for individual labs to
so that's very interesting, because we can see that right from the foundation there was this idea that technology would support science, and also that physics was a very great complement to molecular, the initial field of molecular biology, which is something that has been rediscovered in modern times, right? Now that people try to, cross boundary in science, there's a lot of quantitative efforts that bring in physics and modeling and mathematics back into biology. So it's incredible to see that this was already present from the very beginning.
That was one of the stipulations, that there should be a big engineering department somewhere nearby that could actually share in the making, have engineers who could share in the making of new instruments that would be useful for molecular biology.
But when was then the idea of naming the library after Leó Szilárd?
Well, John Kendrew wanted to name the road coming up from the main road, Leó Szilárd, but he had to put that to the Heidelberg Council, and the council said the road could only be named after scientists that had worked in Heidelberg. And Meyerhof had worked at the Max Planck Institute for Medizinische Forschung until he had to leave in 1939. And so they named it Meyerhofstrasse. But then John Kendrew decided that the library should be called the Szilárd Library, which the little room which is now at the top of the ATC, which is the library, is still got a picture of him up there. And unfortunately he had died, Szilárd, in the 1960s, so he never got here, but his wife came. And we had a visit from her, and she walked around the library and saw the lab. And
it must have been a very touching moment.
It was, yeah.
And then, of course, the library, with of course still in operation, I guess changed a lot through the years, even the years that you have been at the end.
Well, I mean, when I came in, libraries, well, John Kendrew didn't want a computerized library, so we had no computer. And it was just, a library with stamps and a card catalogue, and so we had quite a lot of journals to start off with. And then suddenly I got a pressure from various scientists, could they do online literature searches? I think I had talked to John Kendrew about this before, and he said over his dead body. He said it would be far too expensive. And so 4 people were really pressurizing. So I went to him again and said, this is not a certain decision, but could we have someone to demonstrate how you do online literature searches? And they do that free of charge. So he said, okay, they could do that. And a man called Mr. Pratt came, and the computer department very kindly set me up a setup so that he could do his demonstration. And the scientists who were interested came and looked at it. And I think very luckily, John Kendrew suddenly wanted to know something about somebody. And I said, we could do that by doing a literature search. And I found out some papers on this particular person, and I did tell him that it was only like a telephone. You only paid for what you used. It wouldn't be very, very expensive. But of course, the awful thing was he wouldn't let the scientists use it himself. So we had a little room next to our office, and we learned how to use it. And they had to sit beside us while myself and my colleague were doing the searches for them, which must have been so frustrating for them. I just don't know how they put up with it. But anyway, it was fine. You made lots of friends while you were doing searches.
Of course, you know, with your husband, you had also, through these years, witnessed a lot of other great events. Like, you know, the EMBL became from a single site to a constellation of sites. So can you tell us a little bit of how that came about, you know, setting up of outstations and going towards, even more towards physics, because some of the initial outstations had to do with crystallography, right?
The first outstation was suggested by my husband, because he wanted to use the synchrotron source in Hamburg as an X-ray source, to build beamlines so that they could get much quicker X-ray pictures of well, in his case, muscle. They wanted to get pictures of moving muscles so that they... And Daisy in Hamburg were very willing to have somebody use this. They felt it gave them further justification. But Ken said, you know, if you had outstations, this would also be an addition to EMBL, that they could go and do the do their X-ray work up there, which was much, much faster than a traditional X-ray set. And so it was discussed, and John Kendrew thought it was a good idea. And actually, when this was suggested that perhaps you could have other places that the member states could use, this would be a good idea. Mm-hmm. And I think John Kendrew decided on his own that he wanted to be able to use the source in Grenoble for neutrons, because that would fit in the two. You'd have the X-rays and the neutrons. So that, I think they were both. Yes, because Ken took his first X-ray picture in Hamburg in 1971, so that they had started using that before the main lab was built. Mm-hmm. And I think Grenoble came soon afterwards. But then it all went very quiet, and I mean, we went on, and I think there was the instrumentation development. There was great, particularly electron microscopes. Mm-hmm. And there was a great excitement when the STEM, the scanning transmission electron microscope, arrived, because nobody in Europe, I think, at that stage had a STEM. And Arthur Jones was employed to run the STEM. And I was rushing in the library to get books on STEM, of which there were not, or journals, of which there were not many at that stage, because it was such a new development. And then there were TEMs as well, and so there was a lot of development of X-rays on site. And I think the next sort of thing that became sort of more international was when Ken Murray came to work here, and they set up the data library. And that, I think, had started in quite a small way, but was getting bigger and bigger. Somebody called Greg Ham, an American, came, and it was clear that EMBL was not going to be able to house this big amount of data, and so it was decided that that should go to Hinxton. Mm-hmm. And so then the Hinxton...
They started the data center in Hinxton.
EBI was set up.
When did you leave the EMBL in the end? When did you retire?
I retired in 1998.
1998.
Yeah.
So you've seen quite a long trajectory of the Institute.
Yes.
So what do you think of the transformation that have been from the beginning to the 1998? I mean, this is more or less when I joined.
Well, it was incredibly interesting for me. I mean, we were always having the fight to have a computerized library.
Mm-hmm.
The first colleague I had came from England, and she had worked for a little while in the British Library in London. She'd learned a bit about computers and how to use them. And so we started to computerize as much as we could in our own small way without having a real system. And then after 9 years, my first colleague left, and the second one, she was also from England, but she was much more a computerized person. She came into the library and she looked at her desk and she said, "What is that?" And I said, "That is your typewriter." And she said, "I can't use that." I said, "It's an electric typewriter, hopefully." She said, "No way." And she lifted it up. She was quite small. And she took it back to the computer department and said, "I need a computer." And so she was an enormous help to me, because I was completely ignorant about how you used a computer. And so when John Kedrew left, and then I tried again with Philipson, no computers in the library. And then Fotis Kafatos came. He said, "Give me 3 suggestions and certainly you can have your library system." And so we then started putting the whole catalogue onto the computer. But one of talking about journals, one day somebody who worked at Nature happened to come into the library, and we talked for quite a long time. And much to my surprise, a few days later, I got a telephone call from somebody called, I think his name was Tim Lincoln, who was the man in charge of book reviews in Nature. And he asked me if I could possibly write a leader, because every year in September they had a review of all the new journals, and they had a leader before it of, I think it had to be 1 page or 1.5 pages, not all that long. And I called it The Future of the Scientific Library. And so I think that was one of the things that made me most proud of myself. I thought somebody from Nature has actually asked me to write something. It's usually scientists wanting to get things published, and they asked me to write it.
And I think I was reflecting on the fact that you had a privileged vista, because I guess for a librarian being, I don't know, at the National Library in London or in in a society library, you're not so connected to the production of knowledge. And you have been at the EMBL very connected to the production of that very knowledge that through the years went into the papers and then the book that you were choosing. So what's that for amazing?
I was so lucky. I was really so lucky just to be in the right place at the right time. Because, and there was I trying to say I couldn't do it. And when I think what I would have missed if I hadn't had those 24 years, because it was really very exciting and very, very interesting.
Yeah, and I can say it for myself, but I'm sure I share the feeling of others. We're very lucky to have you for so many years.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.